You're a mother, living your life with a heart forever stuck in 1980, the year your teenage daughter disappeared into thin air at a crowded rock concert, never to be seen again. No calls. No clues. Not a single piece of closure for over 2 decades. Now fast forward 25 years. You're casually flipping through a glossy magazine at the dentist's office, just trying to distract yourself, not even thinking about the past, and then suddenly, there it is. A face. A picture. One photo. And your heart stops cold. Because that face staring back at you looks exactly like your daughter. But older. Grown. Alive. At that moment, your entire world shifts. Everything you thought you knew, everything you'd come to accept, shattered in a split second. What would you do? Would you chase it? Question your own sanity? Or go down a rabbit hole you might never crawl out of? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll get the answer that brought a 25-year mystery full circle, and it's not what anyone ever expected. Hey, I want you to lean in for this one. Not just because it's a crazy, chilling story ripped right out of real life, but because what you're about to hear could easily have been your sister, your best friend, your daughter, or even you. This is not just about a girl who vanished. It's about what happens when a moment of joy turns into a lifelong nightmare. About the gut instinct of a mother who never gave up. And most importantly, about the truth hiding in plain sight that somehow went unnoticed for decades. If you're someone who gets chills when the pieces of a puzzle start to click into place, or if you love true mystery stories that feel too unreal to be fiction, then you're exactly where you need to be right now. This isn't just another YouTube video. It's an experience, one that will unfold like a time capsule that's finally being cracked open after a quarter of a century. So, let's go back. Picture the year 1980. No cell phones. No GPS. No internet. Just pure analog living, where every moment could vanish into the air without a digital trace. Teenagers across the US were obsessed with music, freedom, and living in the moment. That summer, in a quiet town outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, something was in the air, something electrifying. A massive concert was about to take place. The kind of event that lit up every teenage heart like a sparkler on the 4th of July. It was loud, wild, and the kind of thing teens lied to their parents to attend. Among the thousands gathering at the stadium that evening was 16-year-old Rachel Jameson. Blonde hair, a soft smile, always scribbling song lyrics on her notebook covers. She was sweet, curious, and had that restless teenage spark that made her want more from life than her small-town world had to offer. Her mom, Diane, was hesitant but eventually agreed to let her go, with rules, of course. Be with your friends. Stay close. Come home by midnight. But midnight came. Then 1 a.m. Then sunrise. And Rachel never came home. That night, something happened inside that stadium. Something that none of her friends could explain. One moment she was dancing near the stage, and the next, gone. No fight. No scream. No one saw her leave. It was as if she vanished right into the music, right into the night, swallowed up by a crowd too distracted to notice. The police were called. Flyers were printed. Search teams combed the area for weeks. But the trail went cold fast. Some said she ran away. Some whispered about stranger danger. Others just tried to move on. But not Diane. Diane never stopped searching. Not a single day went by without her thinking about where Rachel might be, if she was alive, if she was suffering, or if she was even out there at all. The media moved on. The world kept spinning. But for Diane, time froze on that one summer night. And now, this is where it starts to get strange. Fast forward 25 years, 2005. A random Tuesday. Diane's sitting in a waiting room with nothing to do. She picks up a lifestyle magazine, flipping pages mindlessly. It wasn't even a news article, it was a feature on women entrepreneurs in California. But there, in the glossy pages, was a woman named Julia, a name Diane didn't recognize, but a face that sent chills up her spine. Because this woman, she looked exactly like her Rachel. Same cheekbones. Same eyes. Same dimple on the left cheek when she smiled. Only older. Like what Rachel would look like at 41. Diane stared at that photo for what felt like hours. Could it be? Could it really be her daughter, after all these years, living a new life under a new name? And if so, why? This right here is where most stories would end. But not this one. Because Diane didn't just close the magazine and walk away. She went deeper. She ripped out the page, stuffed it in her purse, and started making calls. That was the moment she made a choice, either live with the possibility forever, or chase the truth, no matter how painful. What came next was a journey that would take her across states, into old police files, dusty newspaper archives, and through people's memories, some helpful, some intentionally hidden. The mystery of what really happened at that 1980 concert started to unravel, thread by thread. And trust me, the moment she knocked on a certain door in Santa Cruz, California, and saw who answered, it changed everything. You're probably already forming theories in your head. Was Rachel kidnapped and brainwashed? Did she run away and start over? Was there some dark secret that forced her to disappear? All those questions will be answered, but you need to hear the full story. Not the rumors. Not the theories. The truth. And believe me, you won't see the twist coming, not even close. By the end of this video, you'll understand what really happened that night. You'll understand why Diane froze when she opened that magazine. And you'll find out what it means when a mother's instinct refuses to die even when the rest of the world stops looking. I think someone's following me. Just moments before Rachel vanished into the chaos of that summer concert, she had leaned in close to her best friend, Melissa, and whispered something that sent a chill through the air around them. I think someone's following me. Melissa, caught up in the electric vibe of the crowd and the thumping bass of the headlining band, barely registered the fear in Rachel's voice at the time. It wasn't until much later, days later, really, when Rachel never showed back up, that those 6 words began echoing louder than the music that had once drowned them out. And looking back, Melissa would say she noticed other things, too. Rachel had been acting a little off for the past couple of weeks. Not scared exactly, but distant, preoccupied. Like her mind was tangled up in something she couldn't fully explain. She would be in the middle of a conversation and just drift off. Sometimes she'd look over her shoulder for no reason, or freeze up when the phone rang and let it go to the answering machine without even checking who it was. According to those closest to her, Rachel had always been vibrant and full of energy, an old soul trapped in a teenager's body who spent hours journaling and listening to vinyl records. She had a tight-knit group of friends, mostly girls from her honors classes and the local church youth group. But there were a few names that started to pop up in the weeks before the concert that didn't fit the usual pattern. There was Evan, a guy a few years older who had graduated but still hung around town, often seen parked outside the high school in a beat-up Camaro with speakers that rattled when the bass dropped. Some said he and Rachel had been talking, that she liked the attention, that he made her feel grown up in a way no one else did. But others said there was something off about him. He never smiled. He always seemed to be watching instead of talking. He had a reputation for getting involved with girls just barely old enough to drive. Then there was the odd friendship she struck up with her substitute English teacher, Mr. Lawson. Young, charismatic, and always talking about pursuing dreams, he had a way of making even the shyest students feel seen. Rachel had started staying after class to talk to him, asking about poetry and college and life outside their small town. At the time, no one thought anything of it. But later, those quiet conversations in an empty classroom took on a different kind of weight. And while all of that was brewing in the background, Rachel had also been spending a lot of time with her cousin, Jordan, who had come to stay with them for the summer after a family fallout in another state. Jordan was wild, older, more rebellious, with chipped black nail polish and a taste for trouble. She introduced Rachel to a different crowd, people who hung out in alleys behind record shops and talked about running away to California, about disappearing and starting over. Diane had started to notice subtle changes in Rachel, more makeup, more silence, more tension. She chalked it up to teenage angst and summer hormones, not knowing that under the surface, something deeper was unraveling. A week before the concert, Rachel had an argument with her mom that ended in slammed doors and tears. The details were fuzzy, something about being overprotected, about not being trusted, but in hindsight, it felt like a warning sign. Rachel had also withdrawn money from her small savings account, enough to raise eyebrows. She said it was for band merch at the show, but that didn't add up later. On the night of the concert, she left the house with a kiss on the cheek and a promise to be back by midnight. That was the last time Diane ever saw her. Witness reports from that night were frustratingly vague. Friends said they saw her dancing near the front of the stage 1 minute, and then she was just gone. No one saw her leave. No one remembers a struggle. No one noticed anything suspicious at first. But when investigators went back and reviewed what little security footage existed, there were gaps. Too many blind spots. And one shadowy figure in the background of several photos, just enough to raise suspicion, never enough to identify. The man wore a dark ball cap pulled low, and in every shot, he seemed to be just a few steps behind Rachel. Not close enough to make contact, but always there. When the photos were released to the public weeks later, no one came forward to say they recognized him. And then the story died. But now, 25 years later, after Diane saw that photo in the magazine, the questions that had haunted her for decades came screaming back. Could that mystery man from the photos have found her daughter all those years ago? Could Rachel have been lured away? Was she running toward someone or from something? Diane started combing through old memories and files, digging up everything she'd buried over the years. She called Melissa, who hadn't spoken about that night in years, and Melissa admitted something new, something she'd never told police. After the show, when she was searching for Rachel, she saw a van idling near the back lot. Unmarked. No logos. Just sitting there with the engine running. Inside was a man who looked like he was watching the crowd through binoculars. When Melissa looked at him, he didn't flinch, he just pulled down the visor and drove off. She had convinced herself it was nothing. But now, it didn't feel like nothing. Diane hired a private investigator with experience in cold cases, someone who had worked on missing person stories that later made national news. Together, they started piecing things together. They traced the name Julia from the magazine feature to a high-end bakery in Santa Cruz, where the woman in the photo had opened a business after moving to California from Oregon in the late 90s. She had no digital trail before 1996. No school records, no driver's license history, no paper trail. It was like she had appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, at the age of 33. But her smile, it was identical. Diane couldn't let it go. She sent the photo to a forensic imaging expert, who ran a facial recognition scan comparing it to Rachel's last known school photo, and the match was a 94% confidence score. Not definitive, but close enough to keep hope alive. Still, the more Diane looked, the more contradictions she found. Julia claimed to be from Montana. Her accent didn't match. Her birth records were sealed. She had no family listed on public records. And the strangest thing, she refused to be interviewed by local media, even when her bakery won a regional award and reporters begged for a profile piece. Meanwhile, Evan, the guy with the Camaro, had vanished from town not long after Rachel did. Rumors swirled about him getting caught up with some rough characters in Nevada, possibly drugs, maybe worse. Some people said they'd seen him in Vegas. Others believed he changed his name and started over. And then there was Mr. Lawson, the English teacher, who abruptly resigned at the end of that school year, claiming personal reasons. He moved to Chicago and was never heard from again. But when the private investigator pulled his personnel file, they found a note in the margins from a school board member: conduct questionable. Possible boundary issues with students. Monitor if reapplying. Chilling. With every layer Diane peeled back, the truth got murkier. People she thought she knew had secrets. Events she thought were innocent took on new meaning. And as she got closer to California, she started to feel like someone else was getting closer to her. Her hotel room was broken into. Her notes were rifled through. And one night, her car alarm went off at 3 a.m., but nothing was stolen. It was a warning. A message. Stop looking. But she didn't. Because Diane believed, no, she knew that the truth was within reach. That Rachel hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken. Or convinced to run. Or manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to spot vulnerability and twist it into control. And that maybe, just maybe, Rachel was still alive, trapped not in a basement, but in a lie. A life she'd been forced to build. A name she didn't choose. And a past that someone powerful wanted to stay buried. What Diane didn't know, though, was that someone else was watching her every move. And they were about to make contact, just when Diane thought she was finally making progress, that the dots were beginning to connect and her search was leading somewhere solid. Everything started to unravel in ways she couldn't explain. The private investigator, Mark, who had been her guide through the murky waters of old files and dead-end leads, suddenly stopped answering his phone. At first, she assumed it was nothing. A scheduling conflict. A technical issue. But then 2 days passed. Then 3. When she drove to his office in Cincinnati, the windows were dark, the blinds drawn, and a printed "For Rent" sign taped sloppily to the door. It didn't make sense. Mark had just spoken to her days earlier about confirming the bakery owner's identity. He had promised to run a full background trace on Julia, cross-referencing DMV records, marriage licenses, anything that might validate who she really was. Now, he was just gone. No voicemail. No email reply. When she checked the hotel he was staying at temporarily while working her case, they told her he'd checked out the night before, left in a hurry. No forwarding address. Nothing. As if he vanished into thin air, just like Rachel had. Diane's gut twisted with the kind of dread she hadn't felt since the first week her daughter went missing. She didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. And that feeling only deepened when she got back to her motel room that night and found her notes missing. She had left her files in a locked suitcase under the bed, the zipper secured with a TSA-approved padlock. Now it was wide open, the papers shuffled, key pages missing. The facial scan report. The bakery employee list. A photo she had printed of Julia at a farmer's market from a local newspaper. Gone. Nothing else had been taken, her wallet, her laptop, her clothes were untouched. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message. Someone had been in her room, knew exactly what they were looking for, and wanted her to know they were watching. That same night, she found a note under her windshield wiper, handwritten on a ripped scrap of newspaper. No greeting. No name. Just 5 words scrawled in red ink: "Let sleeping ghosts stay buried." Her hands shook as she read it over and over, the paper flapping slightly in the night breeze. She knew she had a choice right then and there: go home, pretend none of this happened, convince herself she was chasing ghosts, or keep going, knowing full well it might lead her into something darker than she ever imagined. She chose to keep going. But things got even stranger when she finally got a chance to speak to someone from Julia's bakery, a young assistant named Lila who worked weekends and occasionally managed the front counter. Diane posed as a food blogger interested in writing a feature on successful women-run businesses in California, and Lila was warm and open. She chatted about Julia's perfectionism, her love of pastries, her strange routines, always opening the shop alone, never letting anyone into her office, and never taking vacations. But then she said something that stuck in Diane's mind like a splinter. She said Julia never talked about her life before moving to California. Not once. No stories from childhood. No photos. Not even casual mentions of parents or siblings. It's like she just appeared, Lila said, stirring a cup of tea. Like she stepped out of a dream and into this life. Diane asked if she could meet Julia. Lila hesitated, then said Julia was out of town visiting a supplier. When Diane asked where, Lila looked confused and said, "You know what? I don't think she ever told me." Later that week, Diane got an unexpected email from a burner account, no subject, no signature, containing a single attachment, a grainy surveillance image. It showed Julia, clearly her, standing in a grocery store parking lot, arguing with a man. Diane couldn't make out his face clearly, but something about the posture, the tension in his stance, it felt familiar. Her mind jumped to Evan, the guy with the Camaro from back home. But she couldn't be sure. The photo was dated just 2 weeks ago. If this woman really was Rachel, and if this man was someone from her past, it meant someone else had found her, too. Maybe someone who didn't want her to be found. Then came the real twist. Diane went back to her own hometown in Ohio to track down Jordan, Rachel's cousin, who had dropped off the map after that summer. After a few days of searching through old addresses and social media accounts, she found her living under a new last name, working as a bartender in Louisville. Jordan agreed to meet, reluctantly, and when they sat across from each other in a dimly lit cafe, it was clear that time had taken a toll. Jordan looked tired, worn down, like someone carrying the weight of a long-held secret. At first, she claimed to know nothing. Said Rachel was just a lost girl, probably ran away. But as Diane pressed, Jordan's story started to crack. She finally admitted that Rachel had told her something strange the night before the concert. That she had gotten a letter. Not a note from a friend, but an actual typed letter, delivered to her school locker in a plain envelope with no return address. Rachel wouldn't let Jordan read it, but she said it had instructions, vague ones, about meeting at the gate during the concert and not telling anyone. Jordan thought it was a prank. But now, thinking back, she wasn't so sure. Diane demanded to know why she never told anyone. Jordan looked her in the eyes, tears welling up, and said, "Because someone told me not to." Diane froze. "Who?" Jordan didn't answer right away. She just looked down and whispered, "You won't believe me." Before Diane could press further, Jordan stood up, grabbed her purse, and left. She never returned Diane's calls after that. The final straw came just days later. Diane received an envelope in her mailbox, no return address. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from 1980, an article about the concert night, with Rachel's name circled in thick black ink. Attached to the article with a paperclip was a note, typed in block letters. She made a choice. So should you. But Diane couldn't choose to stop. She had come too far. She had seen too much. And as she looked closer at that newspaper article, something caught her attention that she had missed before. In the background of the image accompanying the story, a photo of the crowd near the front stage, was a man standing at the edge of the ephora. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking directly into the camera. And he looked just like the man in the grocery store photo with Julia. Which could only mean one thing. Whoever he was, he hadn't vanished. He was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And maybe, pulling strings Diane didn't even know existed. Just as Diane was coming to terms with the chilling realization that the man in both photographs was no coincidence, the story took a darker and more complicated turn, one that stretched its roots deeper into her own past than she ever could have imagined. She had barely slept the night she spotted the man's face in that grainy photo again. The sharp stare, the rigid posture, it was like he wasn't just captured in the background by accident, but rather, like he intended to be seen, as if this entire trail of clues had been carefully curated and left for her to follow. That thought alone unsettled her more than any threatening note. But things spiraled even further when she received a frantic call from Melissa, Rachel's best friend, the first she'd heard from her in over 2 weeks. Melissa's voice cracked as she explained that someone had broken into her home, rifled through her attic storage, and taken a single item, a box of old photos and letters from her high school years. Nothing else was touched. Her laptop, TV, even a jewelry box right next to the shelf was left untouched. Me. Just that one box. And taped to the wall beside the attic door was a Polaroid photograph, one Melissa had never seen before. It was Rachel, unmistakably her, standing in what looked like a bus station, wearing clothes no one remembered her owning. She wasn't smiling. She looked tense, like she had been caught off guard. On the back of the Polaroid, in faded ink, were the words, "SG didn't go alone." That phrase sent a fresh wave of unease through Diane. It contradicted what she, and everyone else, had believed for years. Every theory had hinged on the assumption that Rachel had either run off alone or been taken by someone. But this suggested something in between. Someone had gone with her, willingly or not. And now, someone wanted that fact to come to light, just not through the usual channels. It felt like the rules of the game had changed. And worse, Melissa's voice trembled as she admitted she had received a similar note under her windshield the week before but had been too scared to say anything. Hers read simply, "Some memories are safer buried." She had thought it was a prank. Now she wasn't so sure. Diane dug deeper into the past, pulling apart every interaction Rachel had in the weeks before her disappearance, and one strange pattern began to emerge. There was a name that came up more than once, often mentioned offhand in her old journal entries that Diane had kept boxed away for decades. A name Diane had written off at the time, Lee. Not a family friend, not a classmate anyone remembered clearly, but someone Rachel seemed to have been confiding in. The entries were cryptic, full of emotional weight and vague phrases like "Lee understands what I'm going through" and "Lee says this is our chance." Diane had assumed Lee was another teenage girl, maybe a troubled peer or imaginary confidant. But now, as she dug through old school rosters and yearbooks, she realized there was no one named Lee in Rachel's class, not even in the entire district. But what struck her most was an entry written the day before the concert, buried in a corner of a page, hard to read beneath a water stain from decades past. It said, "If I don't come back, Lee will." At first, the line felt poetic, maybe metaphorical. But now it felt more literal, like Rachel had been part of something bigger than anyone had ever realized. Could Lee have been the person she left with? Was this person the reason for the conflicting clues? A partner, a protector, or maybe even a manipulator? It was during one of her endless late-night internet dives, searching through newspaper archives and obscure message boards, that Diane stumbled on something she couldn't believe she'd missed. A separate case, filed the same summer Rachel went missing, just 2 towns over. A girl named Amber had vanished just 3 weeks earlier, under oddly similar circumstances. Summer concert. Small crowd. Last seen speaking to someone outside a gas station. The case had been closed as a presumed runaway, with few leads and little media coverage. But the missing persons report had one peculiar detail. Amber's mother had reported receiving an anonymous letter 2 days after her daughter disappeared, typed on the same kind of vintage typewriter ribbon as the note Jordan had described Rachel receiving. The police at the time had dismissed the letter as a hoax. Diane called Amber's mother, now in her 70s, and when she mentioned Rachel's name, there was silence. And then a whisper, "I always knew it wasn't random." Amber's mother agreed to meet, and when she handed Diane a copy of the old letter, Diane's blood ran cold. It wasn't just similar, it was almost identical. Same tone, same formatting, even the same cryptic instructions: meet at the gate. Don't bring anyone. Your new beginning awaits. Someone had been running a pattern, identifying girls who were vulnerable, who felt trapped, and feeding them a fantasy of escape. And if both girls had vanished after receiving the same kind of letter, it meant whoever was behind it had been doing this for longer than anyone realized. It wasn't a single abduction, it was a system. A pattern. Possibly a network. As Diane walked back to her car, her mind spinning with this new revelation, she noticed a small sticker on her back bumper that hadn't been there before. It was shaped like a butterfly, delicate, pale blue, with no writing. But to Diane, it felt like a mark. A signal. Maybe even a warning. It wasn't just her searching anymore. She was being watched. Someone wanted her to know she was getting close. But the question remained, close to what? And just when she thought it couldn't get stranger, a new email arrived. This one was from a name she didn't recognize, Lee717@protonmail.com. Subject line: "You're not ready for the truth." No message. Just an attachment. A single audio file. And when Diane played it, her knees nearly buckled. It was a voicemail. From Rachel. A voice she hadn't heard in 25 years. Trembling, but unmistakable. "Mom, I don't know if this will ever reach you. But if it does, please stop looking. It's not safe. Not for you. Not for anyone. I made a choice. But I didn't make it alone." Then silence. And at the very end, another voice, male, low, just a whisper. "She's getting too close." The file ended. Diane sat in the darkness of her car, headlights reflecting in the glass of the motel window across the lot, her breath caught in her throat. Suddenly, every theory, every lead, every name felt like pieces of a puzzle that might never fit together. Because now it wasn't just about finding Rachel. It was about uncovering something far more dangerous than she ever imagined. And the real question wasn't where Rachel had gone. It was who had helped her disappear and why they were so desperate to keep it hidden. Diane barely slept that night. The echo of Rachel's voice in the audio file had shattered something inside her: hope, reason, maybe even the illusion that this was still just a search for answers. No. It was something much darker now. A reckoning, maybe. As the motel walls seemed to close in around her, her mind kept replaying that final whisper in the recording: "She's getting too close." It wasn't just a statement, it was a warning. Maybe even a promise. That morning, Diane checked out early, loading her bags into the trunk of her car with the sense that someone, somewhere, was watching her. There wasn't a soul in the parking lot, but that didn't matter. The silence felt staged. Too perfect. As she pulled onto the highway heading west, a black SUV pulled out a few seconds later from the alley behind the motel. No license plate on the front. Dark tinted windows. She told herself it was coincidence. Maybe a family heading out for breakfast. But 20 minutes later, it was still there. 2 car lengths behind. Never passing. Never changing lanes. Just staying close enough to remind her it was there. She pulled off the interstate into a small-town diner, hoping to shake whoever was behind her. The SUV kept driving. Relief washed over her, short-lived and bitter. Inside the diner, she ordered a coffee and sat in the far booth by the window, trying to collect her thoughts. That's when her phone buzzed, a new text from an unknown number. No words. Just a live photo. It was her, from just minutes ago, walking into the diner. Taken from across the street. Her stomach dropped. Her hands trembled. The photo wasn't just surveillance, it was a message. Someone wanted her to know there was no escaping this anymore. The wall between past and present had crumbled, and whatever lived on the other side had just stepped into the light. Diane rushed back to her car and decided to head straight to Louisville to try and find Jordan again. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. But when she arrived at Jordan's apartment complex, something was wrong. Her name was no longer listed on the call box. Her unit, 305, was now labeled as vacant. Diane convinced the manager to speak with her under the pretense of being family. He reluctantly told her that Jordan had packed up and moved out the day before with no explanation. Paid her final month in cash. No forwarding address. Left the key in the mailbox. Diane stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway. Either Jordan had been scared into running, or she had been removed. Back in her car, Diane pulled out her old flip phone, the one she used back in 2000s and had kept in a box of memories. It was dead, of course, but when she charged it that night at her new motel, something strange happened. The screen lit up, displaying a message. Not a text. Not a notification. Just a file titled "Don't Forget." She hadn't saved that. She opened it. A blurry video clip began to play. It was from one of Rachel's childhood birthdays, her 8th, if Diane remembered right. The camera focused on Rachel blowing out candles, surrounded by kids and balloons. But in the background, near the edge of the frame, stood a figure Diane didn't remember inviting. A man, partially turned away, holding a camcorder of his own. She zoomed in on the video. The quality was poor, but the outline of his face looked eerily similar to the man from the surveillance photos and newspaper clipping. She rewound and played it again. Had he been there all along? Watching her daughter before she even disappeared? Diane's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who had been circling her family for years. Panic gripped her as she realized that everything she thought she knew about the case, about Rachel, even about her own memories, could have been manipulated from the very beginning. Someone had planted themselves into her life, unnoticed, invisible, shaping events from the shadows. And now, it seemed they were closing in again. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the corner of her motel room, the blinds shut tight, her phone and laptop powered off. The room plunged into silence except for the hum of the mini fridge. Every sound made her flinch. A car door slamming in the lot. A footstep echoing too close to her window. She was unraveling, and she knew it. Then, around 2:30 in the morning, someone knocked. 3 slow, deliberate taps on her door. She didn't move. She barely breathed. The peephole showed nothing but darkness. No shadow. No figure. Just empty air. Another knock. She backed away from the door, gripping her keys like a weapon. After several minutes, the knocking stopped. Silence returned. But on the floor, beneath the door, a small envelope had been slid inside. Diane waited nearly an hour before she dared pick it up. Inside was a single object, a photograph of Rachel in high school, sitting at her desk, smiling. The back was marked with a single line. "Are you sure you really knew her?" And in that moment, something shifted. Diane realized that maybe the girl she'd been chasing, the daughter she thought she lost, wasn't just a victim. Maybe Rachel had been hiding something, too. Or worse, maybe she had chosen to disappear for reasons Diane never understood. And now, Diane was in it so deep that the truth might not just be painful. It might be deadly. Diane sat motionless on the edge of the motel bed, staring down at the photograph like it was a piece of evidence in a trial she didn't know she was a part of. The line on the back, "Are you sure you really knew her?" echoed louder than any threat she'd received so far. It was too deliberate, too surgical in its effect. Whoever had sent it knew precisely how to strike, not just with fear but with doubt. And that was what shook Diane the most, not the idea that someone was watching her, but the gnawing suspicion that the Rachel she had been mourning, chasing, and clinging to for 25 years might have been more stranger than daughter. The next morning, after another sleepless night and 2 cold cups of coffee, she made a choice. She drove to her old home in Cincinnati, the house where Rachel had grown up, the house Diane had locked and left behind after the pain became too heavy to live in. It had been vacant for years, inherited by a cousin who never bothered to renovate. Dust blanketed the floors, and paint peeled from the doorframes. But the memories were alive, almost too vivid, like the house had been waiting for her return. She made her way to the attic, where she remembered storing a locked cedar chest full of Rachel's things: old notebooks, a collection of concert stubs, folded notes from friends, things too personal to throw away. The lock had rusted, but with enough force and a screwdriver, it gave in. Inside were the usual fragments of teenage life, but then Diane saw something she didn't remember packing away: a second cell phone. Older than the ones Rachel used, hidden beneath a torn concert t-shirt. It was a flip model, barely functional, but when she powered it on, the screen flickered to life, and a string of saved voicemails appeared. The first few were innocent friends calling about school projects, reminders about rides. Then came one labeled simply unlisted. She hit play, and her heart stopped. The voice was male, deep and emotionless. "You will meet me. No one else. If you talk, it's over. If you don't show, she disappears." The date stamp was just 2 days before Rachel vanished. Diane's hands shook as she listened to the message again, but what came next turned everything inside out. There was a second file on the phone, a voice recording labeled R_truth. Diane pressed play, expecting maybe a journal entry or emotional message. What she heard instead was Rachel's voice, calm, clear, and terrifyingly composed. "If you're hearing this, then either something went wrong or everything went right." This wasn't about escape, it was about choice. About exposing what no one wanted to admit. "I never ran away. I walked into the fire because I knew it was the only way to burn the lie down. They'll try to erase me. Make it look like I was taken. But I wasn't. I volunteered. And I wasn't the only one." Diane's breath caught as the recording ended. That one word, volunteered, unraveled years of certainty. Suddenly, Rachel wasn't just a missing person. She was a willing participant in something far more complex and deliberate. Diane's mind reeled. All the clues, all the signs, had they been misread? What had Rachel known, what had she seen, that would drive her to orchestrate her own disappearance and leave behind a breadcrumb trail 2 decades later? She knew there was only one person who might help her sort through this: Rachel's father. Diane hadn't spoken to Mark in nearly 10 years, not since the divorce, not since the pain of Rachel's vanishing had broken them beyond repair. He'd moved to Oregon, started over, buried the past. Or so Diane thought. When she called him that evening, she expected disbelief or anger. But when she mentioned the recording, his voice dropped to a whisper. "You found it," he said, like he'd been waiting for this call all along. Diane's blood ran cold. "You knew," she demanded. There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "I didn't know everything," Mark admitted. "But I knew there were things she was involved in, things she kept hidden from you. She told me once, the last time I saw her right before that concert, that she was going to do something that would make people listen. That it was bigger than us. I thought it was teenage drama. But the way she said it, Diane, she wasn't scared. She was determined." Diane's world spun. Not only had Rachel planned something, but she had told someone, trusted her father with a secret she never shared with her mother. But that wasn't all. Mark said something else that shifted the axis of everything she believed. There was a man. She called him the archivist. Said he had files about students, teachers, even cops. Said he knew secrets about the town, about disappearances no one connected. She said he had dirt on everyone. I thought it was some conspiracy thing, until she showed me a folder. Newspaper clippings, photos, school reports, all pointing to a group of kids who vanished under normal circumstances. Diane demanded to know where that folder was, but Mark hesitated. That's the thing, he said. It was stolen. The night Rachel disappeared, our house was broken into. Nothing was taken but that file. That's when I knew she wasn't coming back. The pieces fell together like jagged shards. Rachel hadn't simply disappeared. She'd stepped into the shadows to expose something buried deep in their community, something powerful people wanted to keep hidden. And now Diane wasn't just chasing her daughter, she was chasing the truth Rachel had died, or maybe even killed her old life, to protect. But if Rachel had volunteered, then who was threatening Diane now? Who was leaving messages, watching her every move? Unless Rachel's plan had gone sideways. Unless someone from that secret world, someone who knew the truth, had turned. As Diane sat alone in the motel room that night, a new message came through. No sender. Just a video. She hit play. It was Rachel. But older. Maybe just a year or two ago. She was standing in a forest clearing, looking straight into the camera. And what she said next shattered everything. If you're watching this, it means you got too close to the wrong person. I told you not to dig. But now, you need to run. Then the screen went black. And all Diane could hear was her own heart pounding, as every belief she'd clung to turned to dust. Diane didn't move for nearly an hour after that video ended. She sat frozen, watching the screen fade to black over and over, her reflection barely visible in the dim glow of the motel lamp behind her. The words Rachel spoke, clear, urgent, and unmistakably real, clashed against every image Diane had carried in her heart for 25 years. This wasn't the daughter she remembered braiding hair at the kitchen table, humming along to cassette tapes, writing poems in the margins of her notebooks. This was a woman who had walked into something unthinkable, something she had tried to warn her mother away from. But Diane couldn't walk away. Not now. The truth was too close, burning just beneath the surface. That video didn't scare her. It devastated her. Because it meant Rachel was alive, or had been alive long after they declared her missing. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Diane never found that out. The next morning, Diane drove to the one place she swore she'd never return to, the old police precinct where Rachel's missing person report had first been filed. It was more out of instinct than logic. She wasn't expecting answers. But what she didn't expect was to see him again, Detective Hal Griffin. He was older, slower, his hair mostly gone and his voice roughened with age. He had retired a few years back, but he still stopped by the station from time to time, and today, as if by fate, he was in the parking lot when she pulled up. At first, he didn't recognize her. But once he did, his face dropped, not with shock, but guilt. Diane approached him and asked him the one thing that had haunted her for decades. "Did you know she wasn't taken?" Hal hesitated, then motioned for her to sit with him in his truck. The engine hummed quietly beneath them, and for the first time, Diane saw the weight Hal had carried all these years. He admitted what no officer ever had, that they'd been told to drop certain leads. Told by someone higher up. He never knew who, exactly. There was pressure, he said, staring through the windshield. From someone connected. Said Rachel's case wasn't what it seemed. That we should treat it as a simple runaway. But I didn't buy it. She was too smart, too intentional. It was like she had vanished with a purpose. Diane demanded to know why he hadn't come forward. Why he hadn't said anything all these years. Hal finally turned to her, his eyes tired. "Because my wife got a call that night. Someone told her they knew where our son went to school. They mentioned his name, his teacher, his favorite lunch. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about Rachel. It was about shutting people up." The air inside the truck grew thick. Diane wanted to scream. She wanted to hit something. But Hal leaned in and gave her a number scribbled on the back of an old receipt. "There's a woman. She worked in archives back then. Said she kept something off the books, something Rachel handed over before the concert. "She's been off the grid, but this might be your shot." But as Diane pulled away from the station, that familiar black SUV reappeared in her rearview mirror. It had followed her before. Now it was tailing her again, but this time, it didn't stay back. It pulled up beside her on the highway, kept speed, windows tinted. Then it veered closer, too close, and she had to swerve onto the shoulder. By the time she regained control and looked back, it was gone. Just like that. Vanished. But she knew this wasn't about intimidation anymore. They were trying to shut her down for good. She pulled into a quiet roadside diner, her hands shaking, her mind spiraling. That's when her phone buzzed. A new message. No number. The drive in her hand suddenly felt like a loaded gun. One decision. Truth or daughter. And Diane had seconds to choose. The sirens never made it to the estate. Somehow, the sound faded as quickly as it had risen, swallowed by the trees, like the forest itself knew how to silence threats that got too close. Diane stared at the monitor, heart pounding in her chest as the smiling face flickered on screen, smooth, well-lit, perfectly composed like a politician on a campaign trail. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His gaze, though pixelated, was unnerving in its clarity. This wasn't some hacker hiding in a dark room, this was someone who knew they were untouchable. The kind of man who had been built by the system they'd just exposed, someone who had let Crow fall so the true operation could continue without scrutiny. Rachel's words echoed like a distant drumbeat. I didn't leave alone. She hadn't meant an ally on the inside. She had meant an enemy that never left. They fled the house moments later, leaving the files uploaded, the body behind, and the truth out in the world. Jen disappeared into the woods with only a nod, a silent acknowledgement that she wouldn't be following them anymore. Whether she was going to disappear forever or face the consequences didn't matter in that moment. Diane and Rachel drove for hours without a destination, only the sense that, for the first time in 25 years, they were moving forward together. They didn't speak much, both emotionally gutted and reeling from how deeply the deception had gone. Crow had been a monster, but he was only a mask. And behind him was a network that didn't care who lived or died, only that no one looked behind the curtain. Within days, the upload made waves across social media. Independent journalists and digital truth seekers exploded with coverage, breaking the Eden Directive wide open. Hashtags like #ExposedFiles, #EdenProjectTruth, and #TheyNeverRan surged across YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok, each clip more viral than the last. Conspiracy forums lit up. News anchors danced around the story, trying to discredit it, but the weight of evidence was too immense, too undeniable. Government agencies issued vague statements about ongoing internal investigations, but the damage had been done. What had once been a dismissed missing teen case from 1980 was now a catalyst for national outrage. Rachel's name was trending again, but not as a victim. As a whistleblower. As a survivor. Still, not everyone believed. There were trolls, bots, and media plants flooding the comments, trying to paint Rachel as unstable, Diane as delusional, even suggesting the files were fabricated by foreign influence. But there were too many patterns. Too many families stepping forward with stories of their own daughters, their own sons, their own questions that had been ignored for decades. The lie was too big to hide now. Diane sat in a borrowed apartment in a city where no one knew her name, watching footage of old men in suits deny, dodge, and divert. Yet, with every denial, more attention poured in. The truth was out, and no matter what happened next, she knew it would never go fully dark again. And still, that face haunted her. Weeks passed. Rachel began speaking at virtual panels under a pseudonym, sharing her story in pieces, never showing her full face, always moving, always changing IPs. Diane remained behind the scenes, but she never stopped digging. They'd blown open the door, but that didn't mean the people inside weren't already rebuilding. A part of her hated that she couldn't rest, that there would always be another name to chase, another lie to unravel. But another part, the part that had been buried in grief for so long, finally felt awake. She had spent 25 years mourning a daughter she thought was gone. Now she had her back, not just alive, but fearless. And that gave her strength. The final loose ends began to stitch together. Jen was found weeks later, dead in a burnt-out car in Montana. Official reports called it an accident, but Diane knew better. A USB was mailed to her shortly after, no return address, with data logs that filled in the missing pieces, confirmation that Crow hadn't acted alone, but under orders from a classified division buried deep in a defense firm front. Dozens of high-level names were listed, each one now under scrutiny thanks to anonymous leaks flooding the public domain. But most haunting of all was a single photo tucked in the folder, an image of Rachel from the early 80s, seated at a table with other children, all wearing headphones, eyes glazed over, as a man stood before them delivering a presentation. The man wasn't Crow. He wasn't even part of the original investigation. It was the man on the screen. The one still watching. The final shot came weeks later in the form of an old magazine. Diane received it in the mail with no note, no signature, just a circled photo inside an article on youth psychological development. The image was from 1981, and in the background, slightly out of focus, stood that same man, standing beside a smiling Rachel. It meant only one thing. He hadn't been watching from afar. He had always been there. And even though the Eden Directive had been exposed, the final line in the folder played in her mind over and over, typed in all caps on the last page. Phase 1. Complete. For Diane, there would be no perfect peace. But there was clarity. The kind that cuts deeper than comfort. The kind that stays with you. And as she stood in front of the mirror one morning, brushing the grey from her daughter's hair, she whispered the words that had eluded her for a quarter century. We made it out. But deep down, both of them knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.